Let me start with a thought that is expressed by the Maharal. We know that most menachos, meal offerings that are brought in the Beis HaMikdash, always have to be matzah. They cannot be chametz. This is not only true on Pesach, this is true the entire year. There's an Isser D'Oraisa to bring a korban mincha that is chametz. The only exception for a communal offering in which the korban mincha must be chametz are the 2 loaves of bread that are brought on Shavuos, the shtei halechem, and that is the only korban tzibor, the only communal offering that is chametz. In light of the fact that the Beis HaMikdash is normally a chametz-free zone, why would we bedavka bring chametz on Shavuos? And the Maharal, as part of a much longer exposition, offers a very fascinating explanation. We know, of course, that chametz is connected to the Yetzer Hara. It represents arrogance, it's puffed up, it represents sin, it represents all of those factors in life that can take a person away from God. And as a result, when you approach holiness and kedusha, you are merachek, you push away the chametz. But through the capacity of Torah, Shavuos is the day of Matan Torah, not only can we serve God, so to speak, with the pure kedusha, but even those factors in life that can normally take a person away from God can be elevated, transformed, sanctified, and utilized. When there's a Torah, you can take even those things that might normally be Ra and utilize them in an elevated way. I know that Rabbi Gottlieb talked about this, but the particular aspect I'm going to talk about is something that also some people regard as a bit of an evil or a distraction. We know there are major debates in the religious communities throughout the world about the role of secular education, the role of wisdom, so to speak, the chachma bagoyim. Some say it's something that we should avoid as much as possible because the only thing that is important is learning the Torah Hashem, and anything else is either a distraction at best or a nisayon at worst that will take a person away from God. But what I want to try to illustrate and discuss tonight is the idea based on this thought of the Maharal, that even things that on one level we might regard as taking us away from God can in fact be elevated and can actually assist us in our avodas Hashem, creating an avodas Hashem that is stronger and more vibrant than might be the case had those so-called negative factors been excluded from the calculus. First, though, I want to just give some introductory remark. I noticed that the title of the presentation is Living in 2 Worlds Successfully. When I see the word successfully, I get a little nervous because that kind of suggests that I'm here to come and tell you the great secret of successfully navigating between 2 worlds. I do not know the exact answer. One has to understand that there's a bit of arrogance for someone to step up and say, this is how you successfully do it. This is a struggle. This is an issue that I grapple with every day. This is an issue that you grapple with every day. We do so as parents. We do so as teachers. We do so in our own avodas Hashem. So I'm not here to give you the answer and how to do something successfully, but simply to share some thoughts that we can work on together to try to grow in our avodas Hashem. We know that when Yaakov Avinu met Esav, Yaakov Avinu was very frightened, and Yaakov had 3 strategies for dealing with Esav. One is he sent Esav gifts, and the second strategy was he prepared for war, and the third, which is the most important, was he davened to Hashem. And there are some Meforshim that understand that Yaakov Avinu's encounter with Esav is a metaphor for how we deal with the outside world. There are aspects of the outside world and the outside culture that we embrace, that we are mekarev, that we welcome, that we contribute to, the gift giving. We don't cut it off. There are other aspects of the outside world that are decadent and evil and coarse, and we must wage unrelenting war. But how does one know what to accept and what to reject. In some ways, an all-or-nothing strategy is always easier to employ in life. One might take the strategy that anything outside of the 4 amos of the Beis HaMedrash is treif chazer, to be rejected. Although if you have that philosophy, I'm not sure how you can use a telephone or drive a car. There are others who make even a more serious mistake, actually, and say, I, as Moses Mendelssohn remarked, be a Jew at home and be a man of the world, a citizen of the world in which they accept everything. Yaakov Avinu is merames that either of those extremities is an incorrect response. There is that to be mekarev, there is that to be merachek. But ultimately, you need siyata deshmaya, you need the divine assistance that one gets through the power of prayer to be able to understand where to make that distinction. And this takes great wisdom. We know Motzei Shabbos, in the Amidah of Ma'ariv, we say Atochan Antanu, the paragraph of Havdalah, and the Gemara in Brachos asks, why is Havdalah there? Put Havdalah with Yalav Yavo, you're marking special occasions. Why is it in the bracha dealing with wisdom, knowledge, insight? And the Gemara says, because Imein Das, without wisdom and insight, Havdalah Minayin, the ability to discriminate, does not exist. Discrimination. What is holy? What is profane? What can contribute to holiness? What destroys holiness? This is not a simple question. It does not have a simple answer. This is the bracha of asking Hashem for das and wisdom. They tell the story about Rav Meir Shapiro, the great Rav of Lublin, who died tragically young, who came to the United States, the founder of Daf Yomi, of course, who came to the United States in the 1920s on a fundraising mission. And in the 1920s, he was exposed to the young, vibrant Orthodox community. Very, very few Orthodox Jews, a few young spirits were trying to revive Orthodoxy in the United States. Irving Bunim, for example, founders of the Young Israel movement. Remember, there were virtually no yeshivos at all in the United States or Canada for that matter. And Rav Meir Shapiro was asked what was his impressions of this young, vibrant Orthodox community, very small numbers. And he was very impressed by their passion, by their enthusiasm, by their fervor, by their commitments, because it was something new and it was something exciting. But he said, American Jews know how to make kiddush. They know how to sanctify, but they have not yet learned how to make havdalah. They have not yet learned how to make discriminations. So, as it were, I am always very, very cautious about using the word successfully, at least in anything that I talk about, because I can't give you a false promise. It is a struggle that we all have to go through. The second qualification I want to put out is that Pirkei Avos gives us very important advice in life. And it says, Aseh l'charav. One needs a teacher, meaning to say, Baruch Hashem, a community like Toronto, you are blessed with great rabbis, Talmidei Chachamim, sensitive Rebbitzins. And again, for the out-of-town person to come in and address such confrontational issues as the role of secular wisdom and what type of secular wisdom and should we discuss evolution in schools, etc. These are issues that, of course, have to go to the poskim of your community. And indeed, this is based on another mimer in Pirkei Avos. Al tadin es chavercha ad shetagiel limkomo. Do not judge your friend until you are in their place. And that's not just a matter of geography. But here I have to point out that whatever the answer to this question is, and however these factors are going to be balanced, it is not a one-size-fits-all. Every person is different. Every child is different. As Rabbi Tatz remarked about medicine, quoting the Ramban, that what could cure one person's illness will literally kill another person. A neshama that may need exposure to certain aspects of the outside world, that very same exposure may be deadly or detrimental to someone else. Everyone is different. What is good for one may not be good for the other. You know, Rav Hutner used to say, Rav Hutner would tell his Talmidim, that if I did not give a piece of advice to you, even if you directly heard me give it to somebody else, don't use it. Don't apply it. Because every single person is different. Every single person will have a different mahalach. So it's always dangerous in any type of speech in areas like this, any type of shir, because we're talking to a crowd, and Baruch Hashem, bigger the crowd, the better, as far as Ohr Somayach is concerned. But as far as the speaker is concerned, many of these inyanim do have to be addressed on a one-to-one basis, and of course, the final reference to this is the pasuk in Mishlei, Chanoch Lenar al pi darko, train a child according to his way, and the explanation of the Vilna Gaon is so well known that it has become the standard interpretation of the verse. And that is, every child, every neshama, has their own unique way of connecting to the Ribono Shel Olam. And the purpose of chinuch is not to remake the child, not even to change the child, but to simply uncover and remove the impediments so that the uniqueness of the child's neshama, their talents, their kochos, can be channeled in the direction that will give its neshama the potential to become what Hashem wants that neshama to become. Chanoch lenar al pi darko is really the guiding light of all educational endeavors. And it doesn't only apply to the nar, it also applies to the zaken, because we have another pasuk, all of Am Yisrael are called nar. We're supposed to be young at heart. And this is a message really for all of us. Chanoch lenar al pi darko. No, it's an unfortunate thing that in many, many ways, we sometimes have negative reactions, overly negative reactions, in response to deviationist movements that made us be more negative than we have to be. Even something as fundamental, for example, as learning Nach, Nevi'im and Kesuvim, which for many, many years were basically ignored in the yeshiva world. Although, Baruch Hashem, things are actually getting a little better. I mean, what could be wrong with learning Nevi'im and Kesuvim? It's Torah, we're not talking, right? But the answer is, well, that's what the Haskalah did. That's what the Enlightenment did. They emphasized, so therefore, if you learn Nach, you're a maskil. Even Zionism, part of the anti-Zionism or the indifference to Zionism, arose even though yearning for Eretz Yisrael is such an essential value in Judaism, is because, those secular Zionists did it, it's got to be treif. In fact, the Ger Rebbe actually made a joke. He says, Zionism was hijacked by the Zionists, and tshuva was hijacked by the Balei Tshuva, meaning to say everybody should do tshuva. But those non-religious people took it over, so now it's not there for us. Right? So in many, many ways, even the great opposition to secular wisdom that's come up in many circles is kind of, to some degree, an overreaction to the fact that proponents of secularism often used it as a way to get away from Yiddishkeit and undermine Yiddishkeit, and therefore there's a circle the wagons mentality in which we must reject it because otherwise we're giving in. It is a normal tendency, indeed, that if something is adopted by the enemies of Yiddishkeit, we have to oppose it. But in some ways, the overreaction might also be incorrect in the sense that it disables us from utilizing certain things in a positive and constructive manner. It is very clear that Chazal did have a high regard for secular learning and secular wisdom. All of us know the famous Maimer Chazal, Chachma Bagayim, if someone tells you, is there wisdom among the Gentiles? Ta'amin, you are to believe them because there is wisdom among the Gentiles. If they tell you Torah Bagayim, that there's divine Torah among the Gentiles. That we don't believe. Torah was given to Am Yisrael. But Rav Hirsch sees this, and of course we know that in the 19th century, this kind of coalesced into two basic schools. We know that the Western European school in Germany, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch, championed the idea of Torah im derech eretz, in which there was an attempt, and I'll elaborate on this as I go on, in which limud HaTorah would be synthesized, integrated, combined with secular wisdom to create a holistic human personality. Of course, this does not mean equal. Torah is the ikar, Torah is the foundation. All of the chachmas must be viewed through the prism of Torah. But Rav Hirsch thought that the synthesis would be a wonderful synthesis. And this is to be contrasted with what became the Eastern European model of the great Litvish yeshivas, Slobodka, Mir, Kamenetz, etc., which emphasized limud HaTorah and denigrated the pursuit of these secular wisdoms. And what was interesting is that the Gedolim of Eastern Europe faced a phenomenon that psychologists call cognitive dissonance, because they didn't know what to do with Rav Hirsch. He was kind of a problem for them, because on one hand, Rav Shimshon Raphael Hirsch was acknowledged as a Gaon and a tzaddik, and a person who literally saved thousands and thousands of Jews from the scourges of the Reform movement that was going through Germany like a cancer. And he built great kehilos. Frankfurt was his kehillah, but his shita spread throughout Germany. So they looked at him only with admiration and even reverence. But on the other hand, they couldn't accept the Torah im derech eretz paradigm that seemed to say that the optimal way that a person would live a Torah life is by integrating and combining it with the secular education. So that's cognitive dissonance. A great man, an indisputably great man, whose shita was very much against what they stood for. So the teretz, the answer that developed in Eastern Europe, was that Rav Hirsch was not advocating Torah im derech eretz as a preferred modality, but he was dealing with a weak, assimilated, ignorant population. And this is the best he could have done. He couldn't have done any more. So he gave them the best, the most that they could take. This is called the Horas Shah, temporary, emergency, leniency, etc. On the other hand, this is how many Gedolim of Eastern Europe understood Rav Hirsch. On the other hand, many Hirschians look at Rav Hirsch's writings, and they have a very different reading, in which this is the Chatchila. Rav Shimon Schwab, the great Rav of Washington Heights, who had a very interesting background. He grew up in a Torah im derech eretz home, but he then went to Mir and absorbed the ideology of the yeshiva. He wrote a kuntris, he wrote a pamphlet, which he called Elu v'Elu. In other words, Elu v'Elu, these and those are the words of the everlasting God, meaning, yes, there was a machlokas. These were two shitos in Klal Yisrael. He did not see Rav Hirsch as a Horas Shah. The same thing is true by a great gadol who made the opposite trek, Rabbi Yechiel Yaakov Weinberg, the Shridei Eish, who started his life in the Torah centers of Slobodka, and then eventually found his way to a university education and in Berlin. And he too concluded that Rav Hirsch's shita of Torah im derech eretz was a vibrant and important mahalech that exists in Klal Yisrael, not, God forbid, to denigrate the other shita, but a shita that deserves a coexistence side by side, once again, depending on Chanoch Lenar, Al Pi Darka. Again, the history is very, very fascinating. I don't want to spend too much time in history, but I do want to make one other historical point. We know that the greatest yeshiva of Europe, the one that is called the mother of yeshivos, was, of course, the yeshiva of Volozhin. The yeshiva of Volozhin was founded by the Vilna Gaon's disciple, Rav Chaim of Volozhin. And the Rosh Yeshiva who led it for more years than any other was the Nitziv, Rav Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin. And many of you know, I'm sure, that in the 1890s, the Volozhin Yeshiva was closed because the Russian government, at the instigation of many maskilim, demanded that the yeshiva introduce secular studies. And the Netziv, together with his assistant Rosh Yeshiva, the great Rav Chaim Soloveitchik, who married the Netziv's granddaughter and was much younger, they decided we will close down the yeshiva rather than introduce secular studies. There was a Masoreh tradition that was lovingly handed down from generation to generation that the Netziv said, better not to have a yeshiva than to have a yeshiva that is tainted by secular chachma. But then we read a contradictory account in the memoirs of Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein, the Torah Tamima, the son of the Aruch HaShulchan, the Netziv's nephew, the Netziv's secretary, and a bacher who was there when Volozhin was closed down, in which he gives a very different account of why Volozhin was closed. And he makes the point that the Russian government was essentially saying, you can only learn Gemara from 9 to 12. The whole afternoon would have to be secular studies. And the yeshiva would have to close at 5 o'clock to preserve the health of the Jewish students, as if the Russian government really cared about the health of the Jewish students. Under those circumstances, which were so extreme, the Netziv says there's no use of having a yeshiva under those circumstances. People could learn more by themselves. But the Torah Tamima writes, the Makar Baruch writes, that the Netziv was actually in favor of allowing up to 2 hours a day of secular studies. Now, I'm not here to decide which account was right. I'm not that old. I was not present in Volozhin when it was closed. But apparently there was a big machlokas here, how to understand what was going on. And I will tell you, this machlokas existed even among the Netziv's own sons. The Netziv's oldest son was the great Gaon Rav Chaim Berlin. Now, the yeshiva in New York is named after him. Rav Chaim Berlin became a Rav in Yerushalayim. And Rav Chaim Berlin was made that the Netziv told him before his death, I closed Volozhin down because a yeshiva cannot have any secular limudim in it. This is Rav Chaim Berlin's account. The Netziv's Ben Zekunim, Rav Meir Berlin, who later changed his name to Rav Meir Bar Ilan, his recollection, he was 12 years old when Volozhin was closed, his recollection was exactly what Rav Baruch Halevi Epstein said. So what are you going to say? I know the cynical person is going to say, well, okay, the more religious son of the Netziv, took the more extreme position. I don't say less religious, but the more modern son took the more modern position. Okay, one might be cynical, but apparently all I'm saying is that these types of uncertainties reflect the ambiguities that we face, even in this day and age. Rav Hirsch points out, if we go all the way back to Noach, if you remember when Noach was naked after the flood, so Shem and Yefes walk backwards to cover up his nakedness. And Noach gives a bracha to Yefes. And Noach says to Yefes, Yafteli kim li Yefes, v'yishkain bi'alei Shem. This is a biblical pun. God shall give beauty, Yofi, shall give beauty to Yefes, Yofeh, and he will dwell in the tents of Shem. Now, in English, that sounds bad. In Hebrew, it's not. Shem is a person. It's not the word shame. Rav Hirsch explains it the following. Yefes was given a divine blessing that it would be a generator of beauty. Yavan, Greece, comes from Yefes. And indeed, Yefes, through Yavan, created many forms of beauty. The beauty of sculpture and architecture. The logical beauty of geometry. I know a high school student wouldn't believe that, but many find geometry profoundly beautiful. I can't say I'm one of them either, but there's a certain elegance in structure. The beauty of philosophical argument. Literature. Sophocles, Aeschylus, Euripides, these were the first dramatists. Even music. Aristotle talks about the different forms of music. So Yefes was given a tremendous blessing the blessing of creating beauty in the world, even the beauty of athleticism. Shem was given another purpose in the world, another task in the world, and that is the task of spreading monotheism, godliness. In fact, people say Avraham Avinu was the first ethical monotheist who was spreading Hashem's name. That's not entirely true. There was the yeshiva of Shem and Aver, even before. So Shem is there to be mefarsem elokus in the world. So what is Noach saying? That which God gives Yefes is beautiful when it dwells, when it is subordinated to the values of Shem, godliness. When it's freestanding and you're menatek, you rip it away from all Shem, then it becomes egotistical, and then it becomes destructive. But when you meld the world of aesthetics, including architecture, literature, science, whatever it would be, and you connect it to all Shem, then it becomes a very beautiful thing. Indeed, there's a famous Mishnah in Pirkei Avos that says if a person is learning Torah and he stops his learning and he says, Ma noa ilon zeh, how beautiful is this tree? He's chayav misa, because he stopped learning to think about a tree. But I think they say in the name of the Kutzker Rebbe, very, very interesting knech. The reason why he's chayav misa is not because he's admiring the tree. He's chayav misa because he's admiring the tree in the context of stopping his learning, meaning, I stop my learning. I'm not connected to Hashem, and I just admire the tree. But if I admire the tree as a hemshech of my learning, then that also becomes a chelek of avodas Hashem. So let me just enumerate a few different ways in which secular chachma can enhance our avodas Hashem, but I will also mention the dangers as well, because one has to understand that indeed there are going to be dangers. First of all, it's very, very clear that if the Torah tells us to create a society, build up Eretz Yisrael, right? Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, the Ramban says, mitzvah d'oraisa. In creating a society, there are many different types of talents that a society needs. Societies need doctors. They probably need lawyers too. I mean, I'm a lawyer, so I could say accountants, computer programmers, policemen, firemen. How is it yitachen to say that pursuing all of these different talents is not really what Hashem wants people to do if Hashem has commanded us to build up societies? I come from Eretz Yisrael, where the politics are very, very polarized and divisive. Although at least in the United States, I think right now U.S. is more divisive than even Eretz Yisrael. And obviously, we in the Torah camp have very, very serious disagreements with the government at various points, and these are issues that have to be addressed. But imagine if one day a miracle would happen, and our prayers would be answered, and all of the Knesset seats would be held by Charedim, and all of the cabinet positions would be held by Charedim. That would certainly be the greatest nightmare of the Chilonim, but I would suggest it would also be the greatest nightmare of the Charedim. How are we supposed to do this and that and that and that and that? We don't have the education, we don't have the background. So implicitly, there must be a legitimation to pursuing these skills, because this is the Ratzon Hashem also. Now, this is true for klal. It's also true for an individual. Again, this is not so much a chachma thing, but there's something about parnasa. I understand the machlokes, Rabbi Yisrael, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but b'derech klal, Pirkei Avos, again says a main kemach, without earning the flour, so to speak, ein Torah. Rav Yochanan talks about malacha, work, parnasa, as a matter of human dignity. He says malacha gives a person a sense of kavod, the inner dignity of being able to support a family. Now that doesn't mean you have to get a PhD in whatever it is, but at some level, to have the skills to be able to support a family is an important Torah value. It's a value in terms of one's obligations under the Ksuva, but it's also a psychologically important value that gives a person a sense of inner dignity, which in turn will enhance their ability to serve Hashem. That's from a pragmatic standpoint. But let me go further. It's very, very clear that a certain amount of chachma is absolutely essential just to understand large portions of the Torah. Many portions of the Torah will not be understood unless one has at least a basic familiarity with chachma. One will not understand the Jewish calendar or the descriptions in Maseches Rosh Hashanah of astronomy and the movements of the moon unless one understands astronomy. And in fact, I know for a fact that for many, many people, a person goes to Daf Yomi Shir, but when he gets to Daf Chaf and Chaf Aleph for Rosh Hashanah, we don't really know what's going on there that well. One cannot understand the laws of Trephos without knowing the anatomy of animals, of cows in particular. There's a number of basic mathematics. Again, it's not necessarily advanced mathematics, but without some basic mathematics, trigonometry and geometry, there will be passages in Maseches Sukkah that aren't going to make sense. That is why the Vilna Gaon is said to have remarked that for every measure of secular wisdom a person does not have, there will be 10 measures of Torah knowledge that he will not understand. This is the Vilna Gaon. And this is why the Vilna Gaon commissioned one of his Talmidim to translate Euclid's Elements of Geometry into Hebrew so that from Jewish people could read and learn about this geometry. We have the book. It's called Ayol Meshulish. It's available on HebrewBooks.com.org. You can get it for free. So that's one point in which, without Chochmah, there are large portions of Torah we're not going to understand. Let me give you a fascinating example of how Chochmah can also illuminate very profound psychological and philosophical issues. All of us know that there's a fundamental principle in the Torah called Bechira, free will. Free will is an axiom of the Torah. Without free will, why should God reward me if I do something good? I had to do it. How could Hashem punish me for doing something bad? I had to do it. By definition, both accountability for sin and reward for virtue depends very much on the autonomy and freedom of the individual to make choices. We all know this. But there are many questions about free will, and one of the questions is that l'chora free will seems to contradict the principle of hashgacha, divine omnipotence. If we believe that God controls everything that happens, whether a leaf falls down or a blade of grass, moves, is because Hashem is micromanaging the universe, so to speak, then how is it possible to say that I can go ahead and do things based on my free will? Isn't it also true that nothing happens if it's not the will of God? Now, this is a well-known question, and there are many answers, and there are many, many approaches. But I want to point out something from Chachma that can give us an illuminating insight into this problem. We know that classical physics is identified as the Newtonian physics, right? Isaac Newton discovered the fundamental laws of nature, gravity, etc. And Newtonian physics is described as a deterministic system. What do we mean by something deterministic? That if an identical force is applied to an identical object, all things are equal, you will always get the same result. Now, granted, all things are never exactly equal, but in theory, if all things are equal, the results will never vary. Newtonian physics is very important. That is why we have cars and planes and computers, because our assumption is if I put the car in drive, it'll go forward. The assumption is if I drop a pen, it'll go down. It's not going to go up. The world is predictable based on scientific laws. Makes sense? That's how we normally look at things. And yet it was discovered in the beginning of the 20th century by Niels Bohr, and initially Einstein was also a proponent of this, although he didn't like it later, that on the subatomic particle level, things are very unpredictable. When a certain subatomic particle is hit by a certain force, sometimes it'll go here, sometimes it'll go there. Unpredictable, indeterminate, randomness. And as a result, quantum mechanics posited there is no such thing as scientific laws. There are only probabilities. We can assess a probability, but in theory, if I drop my pen, it might go up. So if you ask a physicist, well, we have these two different visions of reality, Newtonian determinism and quantum mechanics indeterminacy. Which is right? So the physicist will tell you, Elu v'elu divrei Elokim chayim. They're both right. Newtonian physics does govern big things. So your car will function the Newtonian way, your computer, don't worry about it. You can go on the airplane, unless, God forbid, there's a mechanical failure. The plane will follow the normal rules of physics. And don't worry about quantum mechanics. It only applies at the subatomic level. But I'm going to ask a very simplistic question. Big things are made up of little things. Now, if the little things are simply chickens running around with their head cut off, they go this way and that way and that way and that way and that way, and there's no way to predict how they're going to behave, then how is it possible to talk about any type of determinism vis-a-vis the larger entity? I don't have an answer to that at all, but what I want to say is this. Chazal teach us, Histakel b'oraisa ubarei alma. God looked into the Torah and created the physical structures of the universe. What does that mean? That the deep physical structures of the universe will be a mirror or a portal or a doorway expressing the fundamental principles of the Torah. And the paradox of Newtonian determinism and quantum indeterminacy is exactly the paradox of Bechira on the lower level and Tashgacha on the higher level. Because we are, in effect, the subatomic particles, right? We run around and we make decisions and we have autonomy and we're not constrained by anything because Hakol B'dei Shemayim, everything is in the hands of heaven except for Yiras Shemayim. But in the larger picture, the same way God coordinates the subatomic particles so that the airplane will move in a single direction, so too the ultimate results are biyad Hashem, even though we as subatomic actors. So again, I'm not answering that paradox either, but all I'm saying is that it's a fascinating and I think a powerful idea that when you, and again, I'm speaking as an absolute amateur in this area, and again, I hope there's no physicists in the audience, because then I am in very big trouble. But at least on a simple level, even on a simple level, there's something exciting in seeing that the physical structures of the universe mirror the spiritual depth of the Torah, even in terms of paradox itself. So that's one idea, that it is Chachma that can enable us to understand many aspects of Torah that we otherwise wouldn't understand. Now, there's a second aspect. You need Chachma to apply Torah. Even if I'm a person who knows the entire Babylonian Talmud, the Shas Bavli, Yerushalmi, I know every halacha in Shulchan Aruch. If I don't understand how electricity works, if I don't understand how a computer works, if I don't understand medical issues, or what is a derivative security, or what is a mortgage, I will not be able to give a halachically correct ruling on this, because the factual predicate will be incorrect. This is literally a situation of garbage in garbage out. And that is why any great posek, if they don't have the first-hand knowledge themselves, will have scientists, engineers, doctors, legal experts, secular legal experts, to be able to define the Metzias so that the Torah could be properly applied. Without those chachmos, the Torah cannot be applied. Now, on a deeper level, Rav Hirsch makes the point that if Torah is meant to be lived and experienced and not simply learnt intellectually, in effect, every single area that the Torah gives you rules about needs to exist in the world to be mashlim the Torah itself. If the Torah gives you agricultural laws, then there have to be farmers for those laws to have a reality. If the Torah gives you business laws, there have to be businesses, meaning you need it for the shleimus of the Torah itself, so that the Torah will be actualized in actual ma'aseh. Finally, on this point, the Ishbitzer, who was the Rebbe of Rav Tzadok, and the Ishbitzer for many years was a little less known than Rav Tzadok, but Shlomo Carlebach, Alav Shalom, popularized the Ishbitzer. Rav Tzadok quotes the Ishbitzer as saying a very interesting observation. The Ishbitzer said, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wrote a book, and that book is called The Worlds. He then gave you a commentary, how to understand the book. And that commentary is called the Torah. But the purpose of the Torah is to give us the tools to be able to understand the world. Now, this is a little bit almost the opposite of the idea, he looked in the Torah and created the world. Here the pshat is, the Torah is a commentary on the world, meaning that the world itself is something from which one will learn godliness, one will learn understanding, provided you look at the world through the prism of the Torah. But to ignore the chachma of the world would in effect be like reading a commentary without reading the sefer upon which the commentary is written. If you read Rashi without Chumash, it'll be very difficult to really understand what is going on. So these are some of the positive benefits. Now, one has to understand, of course, that there are going to be dangers, and once again, I do want to point out that the nisyonos of secularism today are very much different than perhaps they were in the 19th century. When Rav Hirsch, said, go to college, do that, etc., what was a German university in the 19th century? Everybody, dressed with suit and tie or whatever type of fashion. There was no problem of tznius. In fact, women were not on the campuses anyway. And the great sakana that somebody would face is, maybe my child is going to read Spinoza or Kant or Hegel. And Rav Hirsch basically said that with Torah you'll be able to deal with all of those things. Today, the university campus, I would almost say halavai, that my kid would go to college and read Spinoza. Now, you shouldn't read Spinoza, that indeed is the case. But, halavai, that would be the problem. The problem today is not so much the intellectual ideas to which a person is exposed, although I'm not dismissing the danger entirely. Today, it is primarily the hedonism, the decadence, the unbridled sexual expression, the drugs. This is a very, very different issue. In other words, it would be a fascinating issue. What would Rav Shimshon Rav Hirsch say today about going to most universities? In other words, one cannot automatically extrapolate from the 19th century to the 21st century. And let me point out as well that exposure to secularism is not merely a matter of the schmutz and the like, but it's also attitudes of coldness, indifference to spirituality, the idea of selfishness. These are attitudes that one absorbs from the street. We think we're immune, we absorb them, and sometimes there's even an attitude, even if a person is from. How do you look at mitzvos? Do you look at mitzvos as the purpose of my life is to serve Hashem and have a relationship with God? Or is the purpose of my life to do what I want, but I got these 613 problems that I got to work around, and my whole avoda is to figure out how do I get around these problems? Again, it's very, very subtle. So there are dangers. There are certainly dangers in opening the floodgates. But the bad news I need to give you is that if it is dangerous and potentially detrimental to be too liberal and too open, and indeed it is also dangerous and detrimental to be too insular. You can't win. You face, in other words, if your attitude is, I want to play it safe, there is no safe option, unfortunately. And that is, number one, if a child is not exposed, at some age, I'm not saying at 5 years old, to major issues such as what is the Torah's approach to things like evolution or various other aspects of science, then when the child finds out about this at some age, which they certainly will, they will not have the coping mechanisms to think that the Torah has anything to say about this. And as a result, they will feel betrayed, and they will feel that the whole enterprise of Yiddishkeit has become discredited simply because, Torah has no answer to this. That's why it was never discussed. Children are naturally curious, even in purely insular environments. I read a little story that a Satmar boy, and Satmar tries to keep, a relatively closed environment, went over to the non-Jewish janitor at the end of school and said, I got to ask you a private question. He says, yeah. He says, I want to know, this was in New York, I want to know, who is this Con Edison that owns all the electricity in New York? So the janitor said, well, Thomas, he started to explain, well, Thomas Edison, invented the light bulb. He said, no, I don't care about Thomas Edison. I want to know Con Edison, as it were. So kids are curious. Kids want to know. You can't hold them back. In many ways, that's a positive feature of life. But that does mean that issues have to be dealt with. Let me just say as well that we have a phenomenon that gets more and more attention, kids at risk, off the derech kids. And this is not a simple phenomenon, and one cannot suggest one reason why this exists, and sometimes there's no reason that we know. Sometimes things happen, the Ribbon Shalom has cheshbonos, there is human bechira, free will, that's at play. So certainly one cannot suggest one reason for this phenomenon, a single reason. But one contributing factor is, once again, that if a child feels that their questions are not legitimate, if they feel that if they raise certain issues, they're apikoros, they're shegets, they're a bad person, that what bothers them is not worthy of being addressed, then at some point the sense of rejection is so strong that they will go and wander off to a place where they can find some legitimation. Now, it happens to be that where they go will not bring them any satisfaction. It'll be usually much worse. But still, if a person is not acknowledged for the struggles that they're going through, this may often cause them to go off the derech. And let me point out that the phenomenon of kids at risk, and I include adults at risk, is much more prevalent than you might think, because it is not only the person who leaves Yiddishkeit. There are many people, children, adults, grown-ups, even with families, who actually might be halachically observant. They keep the mitzvahs, they get married, they have kids, but they are what you might call the living dead. They go through the motions because they want to be good people or whatever, or it's more convenient for them because that's the life and the community they are a part of. But Yiddishkeit and Torah and Avodas Hashem is no longer a chelek of what gives them passion and vibrancy. And at least part of this is because the questions they had were not addressed. But it's not just not having the intellectual answers to the questions, but the fact that it wasn't worthy enough to be addressed. And to some degree, this happens generally when kids have talents, putting aside the philosophical issues. A child has talent in science or poetry or music. And we create structures that basically say, those talents don't belong here. Once again, one is contributing to possibly driving people away from Yiddishkeit. Because we have to believe if the Eibishter gave people kochos and talents, they were not given as a yetzer hara to be surmounted. We have to believe that that was part of the mission that Hashem gave that child to develop that unique koach that is within them. So chachma can be an augmentation. I'll give you one example. The Maharal had a grandson, and it is recorded that one of the grandsons was not able to learn Gemara very well. Perhaps in modern times he would have been diagnosed with a learning disability. I don't know. But he was very, very skillful with his hands. He had a certain spatial intelligence where he could perceive things in 3 dimensions and was able to mold things with his hands. So the Maharal had him make scale models of the Mishkan and the Beis HaMikdash and the Mizbeach. And the story goes that through utilizing this Bacher's strengths, which were not the conventional strengths of the yeshiva students, he became a learned person who knew and mastered many, many areas of Torah by the utilization of the gifts that he had. And once again, although I understand this is not directly impacting on Chochmah per se, but Chochmah is an avenue that those who have talents need to have avenues to develop those talents, or we create frustration and sadness. When there is enthusiasm in life, enthusiasm carries over into everything. The enthusiastic person will learn with more enthusiasm. He will daven with more enthusiasm. He will keep Shabbos with more enthusiasm. But when a person's passions are deadened and ignored, that will poison and permeate every other aspect of their lives. I just want to mention one final point. The final point I want to mention is that there's another point here as well. When you get into the habit of denigrating wisdom, denigrating even beautiful, true ideas by saying they're goyish, they're outside of Torah, you develop a certain persona of cynicism, which will eventually affect the way you view the truth of Torah as well. There is a medrash in Tana Devei Eliyahu that tells us, he who says, I will only cheat the goy and not cheat the Jew, will eventually cheat the Jew as well. He who says, I will only kill the guy, which actually you're not allowed to do anyway, I mean, it's totally usher, but I will only kill the guy and not kill the Jew, will kill the Jew as well. If there is chachma in the world, and you disparage it, you're not open to it, you want no part of it at all, it's considered worthless, then eventually it'll permeate your Torah attitude. Oh, I don't want to hear from that Rav, that Rav is too modern, or this Rav is too fanatic, whatever it is. Eventually you get into the habit of not being able to see emes and be makabel emes. A great person is open to wisdom from all sources. A great person is open to beauty from all sources within, of course, the halachic parameters. And one cannot be mitzamtzem themselves. When you're mitzamtzem a person, when you limit, constrain a person, the neshama become, or at least the expression of the neshama, becomes truncated and deficient, and that will affect every aspect of avodas Hashem. So again, I hope HaKadosh Baruch Hu will help all of us to try to serve Him by seeing the chachma in the world, and of course by subordinating it and viewing it all through the prism of the Torah, and to understand in that way, as we prepare for Matan Torah, that the tachlis of our life is to serve Hashem, and we should utilize all of the tools that we can in order to do so. Thank you.
We had 3 beautiful speakers tonight, 3 amazing perspectives on this topic of living in the 2 worlds successfully. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you felt it was a meaningful evening. The CDs or links to the audio and video will be shared in the coming weeks, and I hope that you'll enjoy it. You can purchase CDs from earlier years outside, and we're going to continue with Mariv for those who want in the shul right now.